So again, these primaries and these caucuses are used to determine who will be a party's nominee. So the person who's going to run on behalf of the party for a particular position. Now, not every single primary, for example, has a clear winner. Right? To become a party's nominee, well, you've got to get 50, more than 50% of the vote. If it's one person versus another, right, so two people involved, right, it's pretty easy to get that threshold because somebody's got to have a little bit more. But in caucuses and in primaries, sometimes you'll have 4, 5, 6, 10, 15 people running for the same position. And so in those cases where you've got a lot of folks involved, it's much harder to meet that 50% threshold. So whenever that happens, we have now a runoff primary. And whenever a runoff primary happens, again, the top two candidates, so the folks of the 4, of the 10, of the 15, whoever, of all of those folks, they all, whoever, the two who got the most votes out of those two, well, now they go head to head. And they, whoever wins this head to head runoff primary, well, then they go on to become the party's nominee for the president, for the governor, for the United States senator, right? Whatever it is. In a few slides from now, we'll kind of look at an example of this. We'll look at the United States Senator for Texas race that is taking place this year, just to kind of help give some examples here. But so if you've got some questions or are still a little bit unclear, just kind of hold on to them. We'll hopefully clarify them here in just a moment. What we're looking at now, pardon, is the primary and caucus calendar for the entire United States. We can see that every state, including a number of territories, so for example, American Samoa, citizens that live abroad, even protectorates like Puerto Rico as well. A lot of them also have primaries or caucuses, right? So this is a way for every state to kind of voice who they care about. We, the Democratic members of Texas, we support this person for this position, or we, the Republican members of the state of Texas, we support this person for president, this person for the Senate, this person for state senator, whatever it happens to be. There are just simply a lot of pieces involved here. One way to help break down all these pieces to really allow you and me to have a meaningful impact is to break us up first by state and then by party. So it's, instead of looking at the whole nation, right, now we're looking at each segment of the nation. So it's a way to really give you and me something of a say in the process, right? And again, since we are broken down by states, the states also have some authority here, some way to control the national agenda, if that is the case. So all these primaries, they take place, and you'll notice the big one here that took place on March 3rd. This is known as Super Tuesday. There's one of these every single election cycle, presidential election cycle, and here we see the highest number of votes kind of up for grabs for each of the different candidates, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in another lesson. So all these primaries and caucuses are used to figure out who will represent a given party for a given position, and all these primaries and caucuses are filling spots to go into the general election. And it's this general election that is used to decide who's actually going to win an office. So primaries determine who's going to be the nominee for a particular party. And now the general election determines between all those party nominees. So the Republican nominee, the Democratic nominee, the Libertarian nominee, the Green Party nominee, all these nominees. So who's going to get that position? Typically, it's a winner-take-all situation. So that means whoever gets the most votes wins. Usually that person who's going to get 51% of the vote, but not always. So the parties are really focused in on, first of all, the primary, They want to get the best candidate that they possibly can, somebody who will have the most possible support that they could garner in support of their particular perspective. And those primaries or caucuses are used to find that person to then run for the general election itself. So we'll move now into a few more particular examples of these general situations. So I mentioned that presidential primaries take place, and Texas's took place on March 3rd of 2020. If you showed up to vote at the primary, well, you were given a list either, again, if you voted for the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, you were given a list of all these different names, right? So the Democratic ballot listed out all of these folks, the Republican ballot listed out all of these folks. Just a quick little side note, right? We got Rocky de la Fuente Guerra and another Rocky de la Fuente. This is a father-son combination. So sort of a bit of a house divided situation. Neither of them got really any votes at all, but this is the first instance that I'm aware of where a father and a son were running against each other for the same particular spot. So again, right, depending on which primary you're voting in, these are the names you're going to see, and you will select one of these different folks. Say, yep, I, a Texas Democrat, think that whoever, Deval Patrick, don't know anything about that person, but hey, I think that person will be the best Democrat Texas has to offer for the presidential position. Or if you're over on the Republican and you really think, you know what, Zoltan Istvan, that's my person. I'm gonna go with that, right? You pick whoever you want, who you think will best represent your ideas, your perspective, the party, whatever it is. And these selections are mirrored for every single race that you are eligible to vote in. So if you live near San Jacinto, well, your representative in the House is Pete Olson. Pete Olson's not running for re-election, but if you're a Democrat, you're given this list of names. If you're a registered Republican, you're given this other list of names. Same thing with the U.S. Senate race. So you pick for each one of these. And again, right, we see a bunch of names for each and every one of these positions. So to help kind of break this down a little bit further, let's look at this Senate race. So in the Senate race, when it comes time to vote, if you're a Democrat, you're given this list. Republican, these are the names on your list. And again, I'm pretty sure I mentioned it earlier, but just to be clear, each party runs their own primaries. They might happen on the exact same day, but each party is in charge of their own. And you as a voter, in Texas, you can pick either one, but you can only vote in one, right? So you can't vote in both primaries, not allowed. So looking at the Republican side, John Cornyn, we see the results here. These are courtesy of New York Times, but we see that John Cornyn very handily won this election. So he got 76% of people who voted in the Republican primary. And these numbers are it's like 2 million people that showed up to vote out of a state of 30 million people, where maybe 15 to 20 million are eligible to vote, but still only 2 million people bothered to show up and vote in this particular primary, right? So these are very, very low numbers. But anyway, these folks determined, hey, John Cornyn, you're winning. And he very clearly got above 50%. In fact, he got 76.3% of the vote. So he will be the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate position on behalf of the Republican Party, right? So he's the Republicans' person. Looking over at the Democratic primary, right? Again, we had all these names, even more folks involved, and we can see the breakdown of the elections over there on the right. So nobody got a 50% majority. So this primary did not yield a winner. So what that means is that the top two candidates, because no one got an outright majority, well, those top two candidates have to have a runoff primary. So in this runoff primary, we had Mary Hagar and Royce West. They had a separate election. This is the election that it was these runoff elections that took place on July 14th, earlier this month. In that election, in these runoff elections, well, Mary Hagar eked out a victory, just barely got more than 50%, just by a little bit. but still over 50%. And so Mary Hagar is the one who will go on to represent the Democratic Party for the U.S. Senate seat that is up for re-election. So in November, the general election, you'll be handed one ballot. Right? So you show up to vote, and it's no longer are you a registered Republican or registered Democrat, right? It doesn't matter because there's only one election taking place. And now you're picking from the winners of all the different primaries. So in this general election, again, this is the one that's taking place in November, you'll pick either Mary Hagar, John Cornyn. There might be a third party candidate on this ballot. And you also always have the option to write in a name. And there's a lot of rules regarding what sort of person can have their name written in. But as a voter, and this is true for every single election, you can write in a name. So if you don't like either candidate and you want to throw your support behind Jason Russell because you think, man, he's the guy for the job, go for it. You can do that. That is always within your power. All right. So we'll turn now to these special types of elections, and we'll look at these kind of quickly. These special types of elections really kind of came into the American political system right around the end of the 1800s, start of the 1900s, and this is a period of time known as the Progressive Era. And the era just before that, so go back to your history class, right? This was the Gilded Age. This is the era of big business and like 4-year-olds working in mines and people working 18-hour days and tenements. And you've probably seen photos of this one tiny little one-bedroom apartment with like 7 dudes sleeping in it with no bathroom and no window. And that was their home, right? So very, very difficult time for average workers during the Gilded Age. Part of the reason that took place was because larger corporations and wealthy individuals were able to kind of bribe their way into whatever they wanted. So a lot of issues there. And then the progressives come around and they say, you know what, the problem here is that big companies are breaking the rules and they're benefiting themselves. So what we need to do is give power back to people. And these 3 types of elections are one way to do that. So the progressives argued. The initiative allowed for laws or even state amendments to be proposed by a citizen. Now, if you think that you want to, if you have this law that you think, man, this would really help our state, you could go around, get X number of signatures, and that number is changed over time, but get enough registered voters to sign on to your proposed law. All of a sudden, that law must be addressed by Congress. They have to take a vote on it. They have to say thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever, right? So you are proposing actual legislation. So you are taking the initiative. You are beginning the legislative process all by yourself. Well, and with the signatures of thousands of other of your fellow citizens. Referendum is kind of allows the citizens to come in at the end of a process. So the state legislature will propose, hey, we like this law, but we don't want to vote on it. We don't know if you guys would like this or not. So on the ballot, we're going to have this proposal. And you, the people, you, the voters, are going to determine whether or not this proposed law or amendment or bond package passes. So I know I've mentioned it before, but I moved from Dallas about a year ago, and the last election I participated in Dallas had a bond package where the city of Dallas was proposing to borrow something like $50 million to put up bike paths all throughout the city. And so this is a huge thing, right? There's a lot of money to have to borrow to do this thing. And so rather than having the city council and the mayor be on the hook for borrowing $50 million, they put it to the voters. Say, hey, people of Dallas, is this something that you like enough to where we should borrow this money? And the city of Dallas, or rather the citizens of Dallas voted one way or the other, and however they voted, boom, that takes effect, just like that. So it's allowing you and me to come in at the end of the process, whereas the initiative allows you and I to get involved at the start of the legislative process. And finally, recall think of it as an unelection, right? So a recall allows voters to remove somebody from office before their actual election, before their actual term is up. So you can kind of kick somebody out, vote somebody else in. Now, to be clear, none of these are allowed in Texas, and also they are not allowed at the federal governments. A number of states like California and Wisconsin and others, they'll have one or two or three of these that are allowed, but Texas does not for a number of reasons. All right, so moving on, we got a couple more topics to kind of discuss before we close out this chapter. But wanted to point out that your book, and a lot of times you probably hear comments like this if you're paying attention to the news or anything like that. But there will be just these very, very broad generalization that urban people, so people in the city center, tend to vote Democratic, or Christians tend to vote Republican, or people in Texas tend to vote conservative, right? There's a lot of these very, very broad generalizations that are oftentimes thrown around out there. And your book gets into some of these, but I really want to caution you against putting a lot of emphasis on these things as being quote unquote real or true or something like that, right? Again, they could be very true at a general level, but for you to look at a female voter in downtown Houston who makes $75,000 a year and works in the medical industry, and to be able to look at her and say, okay, based on these characteristics, these external factors, I'm thinking you're going to vote Democratic. I think you like this presidential candidate, or whatever, right? That that's taking it kind of a bit far. So while there are some general trends, people that attend mass multiple or go to church multiple times a week, they tend to vote Republican, right? That's just a tendency, though, right? Um, be careful in that. It's just something that's going to get you into trouble more often than it's kind of worth. But these are things that are thrown out there, so I wanted you to at least make y'all aware of these things. Turning now to a little bit more on voter participation. As I mentioned a moment ago, most people don't vote. In a presidential year, when there is a presidential election like we have here in 2020, voter turnout in the United States is just a little bit more than 50% of all eligible voters. Now, for non-presidential years, or what are known as off-election years. So these are the ones so president's elections every 4 years. So the ones that take place every, like, the other 2 years. So we're going to have presidential election 2020. So now I'm referring to the ones that's going to take place in 2022. Those, we're lucky if something like 25% of folks show up. For runoff elections, like we saw for the runoff elections that took place earlier in July, for other elections like local elections, 10%, 5% is considered a good turnout. So looking at that, right, looking at the presidential election, let's say that 50% of people turn out. So if you go out and vote and I don't, your vote is now worth kind of double what it was. And you're the one making the decision for me. Looking at more local issues, right? So again, if you go out and vote, if you and your significant other go out and vote together, right? So this class has about just a little more than I think a little more than 25 people. So you and one of your friends, your significant other, whoever, like, you say, you know what, let's go out and vote in this local election. Well, you have essentially spoken on behalf of every other single person in that class. So all the rest of us have given up our political sovereignty, our voice in this election cycle, and you got it. So if you really, on the one hand, that's pretty bad, right? That one person is able to speak on behalf of 10 other people. But on the other hand, if you're that one person, man, you got a lot of power there. You've got a lot of ability to control who's even going to be able to be on the ballot for those other 10 people to vote for come November. Right? So if you want to see change, if you want to get involved, if you want to make things happen, Vote in the local elections. Vote in the smaller elections, as well as the major elections. Right? Don't forget about those. But um, it's sort of, you know, kind of king making in some ways, right? You're determining who the Democratic nominee is going to be, who the Republican nominee is going to be, and everybody else can only pick yes or no to that one person. Meanwhile, you had the whole selection, or rather, you had a whole number of people to select from that might to better suit your particular perspective in life and politics and whatever it is. So now we have to kind of think about this, right? The very, very low voter turnout that tends to take place in America is, should we care? Is this an issue that we need to spend money on changing, right? If you don't want to vote, do I need to pay to convince you to vote, or should we just not care about that? Take a moment to consider that, if you would. Now, further, I'm going to throw out kind of sort of a counter argument. I mean, you have the ability to choose if you should vote or not. Um, so if you choose not to vote, that's kind of your choice, right? Should somebody else try to force you to do something? And if you don't care about getting involved, if you don't want to spend the time that's appropriate to research candidates, figure out who the best person is, well, I mean, is that somebody that you want to have voting? Right? If you spend hours upon hours over the course of 5 months looking into candidates and issues and any proposed legislation that's on your ballot, and then the person next to you just kind of said, "Oh yeah, it's election day. I better go out and vote. I don't know who. I don't even know who's running. I'm just going to pick a name." Right? Is that somebody you want voting? I mean, at some point, there's got to be some kind of cutoff, right? So anyway, kind of regardless of how you answered any of the questions here, let's kind of put everything back into a bit more of a bigger perspective on elections themselves. Um, Elections are a key to limited government. If we lived under a monarchy or a tyranny or an oligarchy of some sort, right? You and I, just regular people, wouldn't get the chance to vote. We wouldn't have a say over who the rule makers are. We just wouldn't. So these elections are a really powerful tool that you and I have as a check against the government. Number one, especially if we get involved in the lower level elections and the primaries and things like that, we can really ensure that good candidates are selected. We can make sure that people of good, upstanding morals and virtue and honest sort of politicians are picked. Again, if that's what, you know, if we want the liar and the cheater, great. That's your call. I wouldn't vote for that person. But anyway, it also helps to build this general consensus behind the voter, right? Behind the candidate and the person who wins in office. It gives sort of um, an impetus to act. If you win an office, if most Americans supported you as a person, right? That's a mandate, right? You can go out and you can use that authority and you can say, hey, 67% of America voted for me, so I should be the one in charge. um, it also allows people to kind of rally together, right? If you have a candidate versus another candidate, well, you kind of pick one or the other. And in doing so, maybe you get a little bit more excited. Maybe you get a little bit more invested in the election itself. And finally, and most importantly, this is our way to voice our sovereignty, our political power, our authority. This is our chance to put a stamp on the government to make it look more like what we want it to. Now, again, our particular voice, our single individual voice, is going to be pooled with that of a whole bunch of other people, but it's our voice, it's our power. And if we don't speak up, if we don't cast a ballot, well, we're giving that to somebody else. We're just kind of leaving it behind and saying, oh, who cares that all these people fought and died over all these hundreds of years? Who cares? I don't care. I'm busy. I'm hungover, I'm tired, I forgot. Well, you're just giving up. Please don't give up. Register to vote. Don't forget to do that. Take care. Have a good day.